Okay, how's it going? This is Nathan Branson here. This is English 242, British literature. And I'm going to talk about Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol today. I'm just going to go over part one, or just a brief section of the short story, or the novella as we might call it. It is 80 pages long. And I'm going to go over the first, I guess you'd say, the beginning, whenever we're introduced to Scrooge and his nephew. And I want to talk a little bit about, first of all, with when you're reading fiction when you're reading fiction in general, some of the devices that authors use a lot of times. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that we're probably familiar with this, and you might have seen a TV show, a recreation, remake of this movie, or even maybe for instance, like the Muppets Christmas Carol, or even It's a Wonderful Life. So if you've seen it, It's a Wonderful Life, that is a movie that was based on the template of It's a Wonderful Life, which is probably one of my top five favorite movies of all time. The template is based off of this. And if you're a writer, you could use Dickens's template of having a character visited by ghosts, or some other, I don't know, some other ghost or situation where they're looking at their past, their present, and their future, and they're sort of, it's almost like a dream. So if you're a fiction writer, this is kind of using this kind of template is very useful, and I think templates a lot of times can help us if we're just starting out in writing. Sorry. So I'm going to actually get a drink of water. Wait 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. Now I'm back. And what do we know? That's what we know about A Christmas Carol, that is probably familiar to a lot of people. But it's aimed at all ages. And one of the downsides of looking at A Christmas Carol is the fact that it is, it feels familiar, and then we kind of say, I think that's for, high school students or middle school students, or it's not for me, I'm older, and I'm wanting something a little bit more complex for this literature class instead of this stuff for middle and high schoolers. And I want to challenge that, because this particular story aims at two big philosophical questions that we need to, that are always seem to be relevant, no matter what decade you live in. It's definitely relevant today. And the two questions written up here on the board: does money make you happy? We're still asking that question today. I had a student write a paper about that last semester. Does money make you happy? So in my literature class, I always have big questions, sort of like timeless questions. There's probably, you could probably come up with about 40 questions that are relevant in 2020. They were relevant in 2000, 1950, 1900, 1850, even back to 1500, and they're still relevant questions that we ask in literature, and we can get answers out of it. They're up for discussion, and that's why we take literature classes to sort of like face these questions. So that's the first question that Dickens is kind of hitting on. We can see it even in this first part of Christmas Carol. And the second one is hitting on a little bit, why does poverty exist? Or you might look at it as, why do class differences make people separate from one another, which is real, is very real as well. So this could almost be three questions. Why do the poor not hang out with the rich? Why do the rich sometimes separate themselves? Why does poverty exist? in a first world country like England. I would say at Dickens' time, it was a very successful country, one of the most powerful countries in the world. So why does poverty exist in a culture like that culture, or a culture like today? Why does poverty exist? So those is answering those questions. It's hitting on those things. So that's why we're going to read it. That's why we're reading this story, and it's sort of the same with in American literature when you read something like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and that is from a teenager's perspective. Huck Finn is a younger boy, or about teenage years, and he is drifting down the Mississippi River with an escaped slave. And so because he's doing that, that is a hitting on big cultural issues. Not long after Dickens wrote this, he wrote that in 1870, so it's not that long after. So those are the kind of stories we read in high school and maybe middle school, and then we can kind of brush them off. But we don't want to do that, and I think that Dickens was writing this story especially. I think it's relevant to anybody over the age of 18, because the main character is an older man who is pondering his life. And so if anybody needs to read this, it's probably people over the age of 30 who are established, who have wealth, and who may have become a little bit bitter. That's the definition of Scrooge, as we will see. So I also believe that literature is for people a lot of times over the age of 22, after you get out of college, whenever you are wrestling with some of these big life questions. But since you're in college right now, it's good to wrestle with these now so that you can not turn into Scrooge. Ultimately, that's what we don't want. We don't want to be that guy. So as I said, it's for all ages, this kind of literature. And I also want to talk a little bit about dialogue. So that is something we see in the first part of A Christmas Carol. And dialogue can be powerful. It can be a representation of the conversations that we might encounter, or even sometimes the kind of conversations we have in our own heads, inner dialogue. And the main reason I think Dickens used dialogue between nephew, we don't get his name at the beginning, and Scrooge, is because it gives us an impression of their personality and their values. So what are Scrooge's values? What are the character traits, or what's the personality of his nephew? And so on the surface, we might say, well, Scrooge is an introvert, and his nephew is an extrovert. His nephew is really adamant about having him come to this party, whereas his so yeah, that's kind of the use of to see their values. What are their values? And we can it's used in this way in fiction. You either want to do this with dialogue if you're a fiction writer, or setting. Those are two things that you can start off with whenever you're writing something. Is if you have a strong dialogue, you can see what this person is like, or another secondary character. What are they like? Or you can start with the setting, and the setting can also be very make a strong impression. If you watch any television show, I know a lot of television from the 90s, but most 90s television shows were very, they started off with a scene, sort of a scene that over like a helicopter shot of San Francisco or LA, or a helicopter shot of some small town that the movie is going to be based in. And so since we don't have that, Dickens doesn't have that, he might start off his story with a description of the town. And so we'll see that in bits and pieces. It's not as long. But if you're reading British literature, there are no photography is not as it's not the same as it is today. There are not images of things everywhere. So Dickens can't just show you a picture. He has words. There are no videos then. Videos were not created, so they can't show you a video of what something looks like. So he's got to describe it to you. So if you find yourself thinking, "Wow, this is a long description of something," it's because they didn't have images. There are no images to show you things. So that's something to keep in mind. Today I want to talk about dialogue specifically to help us understand this. Now, and to think about another movie example, I want to talk briefly about the movie Rocky, which is about a boxer. And so the beginning of Rocky, you meet him, and he's this Sylvester Stallone. He's a boxer, and we see him walking the streets of his hometown of Philadelphia. In a part of Philadelphia, he's talking to people, he's interacting with people, he's going into this pet store. 30 minutes of this, of him just walking around, not really boxing much. And you're kind of like, well, I thought this was about boxing. I thought this was about some guy who's an underdog, which it is. But a good portion of that movie is about us wanting to understand who this man is, and the director wants us to like him. So it's like, hey, this guy's a good guy. We need to pay attention to him. And so whenever you're watching a movie, you're going to get maybe some little bits of conversations, interactions with a character before you see them come up to their main conflict. It's the same thing with Scrooge, except it's the opposite. He's not a likable person. Rocky, Sylvester Stallone in that movie, goes on to become the underdog boxer. The girl in the pet store that he keeps visiting, that becomes his girlfriend. Her name's Adrian, and that's part of the movie. But in this situation, Scrooge, we have him, and he's not likable. So what's going to happen to this unlikable man? What do we do with this man who's not likable? Well, in a narrative like this, we want to see something happen to him. Hopefully that it will change him. Hopefully something where he is, some light bulb goes off in his head and he's like, oh, I'm actually I'm actually unhappy. Because he doesn't seem happy, you know. If he was maybe being a jerk to people and he was happy, maybe it would seem like a more acceptable story. But he's just not a happy person. And the evidence of this is in the dialogue between him and his nephew. So his nephew comes in his story and he says, why are you dismal? What reason do you have to be morose? You're rich enough. So that's what his nephew says to him early in the story. Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said, bah, again, and followed it with humbug. Don't be cross, uncle, said the nephew. What else can I be, returned the uncle, which I live in such a world of fools as this. Merry Christmas, out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer, a time for balancing book and having every item round dozen a month presented dead against you. If I could work my will, every idiot who goes around with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should. He sounds like a pretty miserable person. Uncle, pleaded his nephew. Nephew, returned his uncle sternly, keep Merry Christmas in your own way, and let me keep it in mine. Keep it, but you don't keep it, says the nephew. So this starts off with this. Scrooge is not in a good mood here. Okay. He also says, Merry Christmas. What right do you have? What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough. This is Scrooge talking to his nephew. Come then, Returned nephew gaily. What right have you to be dismal? What reason do you have to be morose? You're rich enough. So the nephew is happy. He doesn't seem to have a lot of money. And then the uncle is Scrooge is not happy. So again, let's get into that big question: what does money make you happy? Question we asked today. So this is quick and automatically in this interchange. It's almost like an argument. It's an intense conversation between two family members, as family conversations often can be. Do we get an impression of their character? So whenever you're reading something like this, think about what this shows about their values, and that could be something you could write about in your for an essay, which you will have to do. Maybe for this particular essay, you'll have different choices, but you may have to write about what are the values of Scrooge and be able to articulate that clearly. So as we go forward, another theme we could see in this is something the nephew says, and he says an interesting thing. He says, "There are many things from which I might derive good, by which I have not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew. "Christmas among the rest. I'm sure I have always thought of Christmas time when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin. If anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as they really were, fellow passengers to the grave, another race of creatures bound on other journeys." So here we can see a little bit description of poverty and how sometimes if somebody is not as well off, poor, how they might be seen as less than, whereas somebody who's wealthy could be seen as more meaningful, to live a more meaningful life, to have more value in our society. And that's an age-old question. Why is it sometimes that the people who aren't as well off are seen as less than people who are wealthy? And as we can see, his nephew seems to be a very hardworking, good man. So there's no reason for somebody from Scrooge's perspective to really need to judge him for being poor. But that's kind of the vibe we get from Scrooge. He's judging his nephew, maybe for not being as wealthy as he is, or we really don't know. At this point in the story, it's hard to really understand what the heck is wrong with Scrooge. Okay. So then we come up to this, and he says, and then the next part of it is, he says, "Why can't we be friends?" So and this is a family member, he's saying, why can't we be friends? His nephew is being very kind to him. Why can't we be friends? And he says, "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why can't we be friends?" And then his nephew is very straight to the point. So, and this is something interesting too. Why are some people a little bit antisocial? And then you're not really sure why they're not interested in maybe something they're invited to, or and this brings up a euphemism where Scrooge says "good afternoon" multiple times. He's trying to get rid of his nephew. He's tired of talking about this. And it made me think about something that my old roommate said one time. He said, who was one of the most welcoming people I've ever been around. His name is Daniel. And he says, "If I invite someone to hang out 3 different times, and each time they give an excuse not to hang out, I just assume they may not want to hang out or may not want to be friends." So I see my old roommate Daniel very much like the nephew, very open, hospitable, and consistent in trying to help people or invite people into whatever he's doing. And so he's getting he's talked to me about how he gets lots of excuses. People will say, I'm busy. I'm working. I'm not feeling so well. I'm tired. I don't have money. I didn't sleep well last night. Or sometimes if you send somebody a text message, they're like, well, no response at all. So I think we can kind of empathize, maybe be in the shoes of the nephew of not sort of a kind of rejection. Like, and that's what Scrooge seems to do. He seems to reject other people. And sometimes you're like, wow, this guy is giving a lot of lame excuses. And the bravery of the nephew is that he keeps pushing. So the theme there, again, is that what's wrong with Scrooge? Like, what is his problem? Again, I said I think it's more than him just wanting to spend some time alone. I don't have anything against introverts who turn down party invitations. Sometimes I do, actually. But I'm extrovert, and sometimes I don't understand why people are like, I'm going to stay at home alone. But there's something more than that with Scrooge, that he is alone. He's older. He doesn't have really an immediate family. And like, he won't, what's going on here? So that's part of this story here, is this ability for Dickens to bring out these questions from this one conversations. So if you're a writer and you're starting out, if you have an intense conversation at the beginning, that can help us bring out the values of each of the characters. So I've got written up here behind me, what is Scrooge? What does each person value? Intense conversations bring out the true personality of a person. Maybe we do learn about whether they're introverted or extroverted. In this case, we see his nephew as somebody is very kind-hearted and open and content, whereas Scrooge is not that. Okay, and then it's the advantages of starting a story with dialogue. So all that to say, those are the main things I wanted to point out today. This part one. And I'll leave with this last point. And what does it take for a person to change? In this case, we want to see Scrooge change. If you're talking about Rocky, the movie, we want to see him succeed in whatever he's doing. So that's kind of a different story. In A Christmas Carol, it's more of, we hope that whatever is bothering Scrooge can be solved. We hope that something can change so that he can move forward in his life as an older man who's alone on Christmas. And he can, maybe it's a mystery to himself. It seems to be. That's why he's so closed off. So what will change him? And something is going to happen to him that will change him. And the question, of course, a lot of you guys already know what that is because you've seen these movies or you've read this before maybe earlier in life. But the question, ultimately, we ask ourselves, what about us, maybe, what does it take to change us? What dramatic thing has to happen sometimes for us to change? Is it possible for people who are closed off to change? Those are some other questions we can think about. And sometimes it takes something dramatic for a person to change from their ways. So again, that's the main part of the sort of the beginning of Christmas Carol. We're getting to understand Ebenezer Scrooge, his nephew, and the next session, the next part, I will go over some of the later themes as we look at what happens next, what happens to Scrooge in order to help him open up his heart and consider, should I change my life? Am I a jerk? What should I do about my work habits? Am I workaholic? He kind of starts to think about these things that he becomes reflective. And that's awesome. And so you keep reading to see how that happens. And hope you guys are enjoying it. I will talk to you guys later.